Hey folks, in previous videos we refreshed and reinstalled the rear subframe and most of the rear suspension. In this video we're going to refresh the rear differential and install the new sway bar. This video was delayed because of Hurricane Ian. My workshop was flooded and the car itself was almost flooded as well. But I was eager to get back to work on the BMW so it would be drivable again. Okay, let's start with the rear differential. I bought some new seals and a finned cover plate. I'm also going to replace the differential oil with Mobil 1 synthetic. The first thing I'm going to do is drain out the old differential oil. The differential has a drain port near the bottom and a fill port on the rear cover. Apparently, I didn't notice the drain port, so I drained it through the fill port. Anyway, the oil that came out was almost black, so it was way overdue to be replaced. Since I'm replacing the seals, that means the input and output flanges need to be removed. The input flange uses a 30mm nut with a locking collar thingy. Removing that is simple enough with an impact gun. But the input flange didn't want to come loose, so I used a steering wheel puller. That worked great. I should also mention that I put alignment marks on each piece so I can put them back together exactly how they were before. Now I'm going to remove the input shaft seal. The service manual says you can use a big screwdriver, but I guess my screwdriver wasn't big enough. But if you squint just right, this tire iron looks like a really big screwdriver. And it got the job done. Next, I'm going to remove the output flanges. They're held in the differential with a snap ring. You have to pry on them until it pops loose. I used a small block of wood to give me something to pry against, and a small pry bar to pop it loose. And once again, we're using a really big screwdriver to pry out the seals. Alright, the old seals are out. Now we can install the new ones. I cleaned out the hole and put some fresh differential oil on the seal. The service manual says the output seals should be pressed in until they stop. The new seals went in a little bit further than the old ones, so apparently the original ones weren't pressed in all the way. Hopefully this doesn't cause the seals to leak. Also notice I'm using a block of wood to reinstall the axle stubs. I don't want to hit them directly with the hammer. For the input shaft seal, the manual says to press it in until it's flush with the differential casing. So I was careful not to press it in too far. I stopped several times to check on it. And when I reinstalled the input flange, I also made sure to line up all those alignment marks I made earlier. Next item on the list is the finned cover plate. I bought it used off eBay and it was pretty grungy. It had a thick patina that appeared to be a combination of corrosion and salt residue. There was a lot of that stuff between the cooling fins, so I gave it a thorough cleaning. I went after it with some degreaser and an assortment of different brushes. I had to use pipe cleaning brushes to get between the fins. After the cleaning was finished, I decided to paint it. I'm using silver-colored engine block paint. This stuff is rated for 550 degrees Fahrenheit, so it should have no problem handling the heat from a rear differential. I let the paint dry overnight. Actually, overnight turned into next week, because the next day Hurricane Ian rolled through my neighborhood and made a big mess. So I had to do some hurricane cleanup and deal with some flooding in my workshop. Anyway, let's get this differential cover installed. Of course, we need to remove the old one first. That was simple enough. The bolts are not super tight, so they zip right out. But when I removed the cover, I saw some black residue inside the differential, so I decided to clean it out. I hosed it down with brake cleaner to wash that stuff out. I also took this opportunity to check the inside of the differential. I looked for any signs of abnormal wear on the gears, or any chips or cracks. But everything looks good. According to the service manual, the differential takes about a liter of gear lube. I decided to use Mobil 1 Synthetic 75W90. It meets the GL5 specification. It also has friction modifier for limited slip differentials, although that doesn't matter because this is not a limited slip differential. I decided to pour in the oil now instead of having to pump it in through the fill port later. Okay, we're almost ready to install the new differential cover. However, there is one difference between the finned cover and the plain cover. The finned cover needs a longer bolt for this one bolt hole. The cover that I bought didn't come with any mounting bolts, so I had to buy one. Actually, I ended up buying all new bolts for the differential cover, because the old ones were pretty rusty, and it would look silly to have rusty bolts on a freshly painted differential cover. In case you're wondering, the short bolts are 25mm long, and the longer bolt is 60mm long. Alright, time to install the cover. It originally had a paper gasket, but apparently BMW discontinued the paper gaskets. Now they recommend using RTV sealant instead of a gasket. I figured the black RTV would work. I mean, it works on oil pans and stuff. I was careful not to put too much RTV on there because I didn't want globs of RTV sealant floating around inside the differential. Then I put on all the bolts finger tight and I tightened them just enough to make the sealant start squeezing out. Now the sealant needs to sit for about an hour so it can cure. The RTV has been sitting for about an hour, so it's time to torque those bolts. I couldn't find the torque spec in the service manual, so I searched online and found conflicting results. Go figure. But for a 10mm diameter grade 8.8 bolt, 45 Newton meters seems reasonable, so I went with that. I torqued the bolts in two stages, first to 30 Newton meters, then to 45. And as you can see, I torqued the bolts in a crisscross pattern, so the cover was tightened evenly. We're almost ready to install the differential. But before we do that, we need to torque the control arm bolts that go into the subframe. Because after the differential is installed, those bolts won't be accessible. Also, a couple of those bushings are rubber, so I need to jack up the suspension before I torque those bolts. Okay, now we can install the differential. Previously, when I did the differential swap from an X3, I used a jack to lift the differential into place. That was kind of a hassle because the differential needed to be tilted upwards first and then it had to be tilted back down, all while sitting on the jack. So I had to play around with wood spacers and stuff. This time I decided to lift it in place by hand. I put an old shirt on the subframe so it won't get scratched up, and I used a furniture dolly to roll the differential under the car. To be honest, it was still kind of a hassle. I had some difficulty getting the bolts to line up, But I think that's because of the urethane bushings. They're not as flexible as rubber, so the bolts need to be lined up perfectly or they won't fit. And of course I was trying to do all that while also holding up the rear differential, which is not exactly featherweight. On the plus side, I got a nice workout. With the rear differential in place, I can reattach the drive shaft and the CV axles. I also use the parking brake to hold everything in place while I torque the bolts. And I put a mark on each bolt after torquing it so I wouldn't lose track. I also reinstalled the heat shields off camera. Now we can install the rear sway bar. The end links are already installed in the control arms. I did that in the last video. I figured I would attach the bar to the end links first, then swing the bar up into place. But when I tried that, there wasn't enough room to install the brackets for the center bushings. So I had to take it all back apart and do the center bushings first. If you remember, when I installed the front sway bar, the center bushings didn't have the split cut in them, so I had to cut it myself. But on the rear sway bar, the bushings do have the split, so that's nice. Anyway, I finally got the sway bar installed, and off camera I also reinstalled the exhaust and stuff. At that point it was getting late and I was getting pretty tired, so I called it a night. Okay, so everything is installed. I just need to make some adjustments to the rear suspension. I put marks on the adjusting collars on the springs and on the shock absorber bodies. That makes it easier to keep track of things. I guesstimated the ride height before I installed everything, and my guess was way off. The ride height was actually higher than stock, so I had to use trial and error to get the ride height where I wanted it. Adjusting the rear suspension is kind of a pain because the spring and the shock are separate. So for example, when I shortened the ride height adjuster on the spring, that created slack in the spring. And I don't want the springs to fall out, so that meant I had to shorten the shocks to take up the slack. Then I had to put the wheels back on, put the car back on the ground to check the ride height, and so on. But eventually I got the ride height where I wanted it. With the old suspension, the ride heights were all over the place. Partly because of the worn-out suspension parts, and partly because of the deformed strut towers. But with the new suspension, the front ride height is about 13.5 inches on both sides, and the rear is about 13 3/4 on both sides. No more crazy mismatched ride heights. Alright, the rear suspension is finished. This also finishes the entire suspension project, and it finishes this video. By the way, you like my rear end? Come on, admit it.